Hello and welcome to another episode of Mormon History Podcast. I am your host, Skylar. Thanks for tuning in today. If you would like to reach out to me, you can email me at mormonhistorypodcast@gmail.com. And if you would like to make a donation, you can do so by donating a coffee, if you will, at buymeacoffee.com/Mormon. Now, regarding this episode and this topic, there are other episodes of other podcasts who dive a lot deeper into this subject. The point of the Mormon History Podcast, I'm trying to keep these interesting facts or history to less than 30 minutes. Just think of it as a starting point for these discussions, and if you want to dive more into them, then it gives you something to look at. Now, mostly I would say in the ex-Mormon community, people reference the happiness letter. I don't know that it is particularly referenced as such within the church, but the church is not a stranger to the content contained within. Now, if you go to churchofjesuschrist.org, also known as previously LDS.org, and you do a search for, quote, happiness is the object, unquote, you will find quite a few pages of talks that reference this teaching of Joseph Smith. And they usually say this much of it. Quote, happiness is the object and design of our existence, and will be the end thereof if we pursue the path that leads to it. And this path is virtue, uprightness, faithfulness, holiness, and keeping all the commandments of God, end quote. And as far as where most of them say that it comes from is the teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith, which was organized by Joseph Fielding Smith from 1976, pages 255 and 56. Now, I have a version of this book from 1946, and page 255 and 256 following into 257 all contain the same information. But the footnotes of that come from DHC 5, 134, 136, and it comes from August 27, 1842. And the front of the book references DHC as Documentary History of the Church. Now, as a member of the church, if you're reading Our Search for Happiness by President James E. Faust, who was a second counselor in the first presidency at the time of writing this talk, you would probably think, well, that's a good thing to have. If Joseph Smith taught us that happiness is the object and design of our existence, well, we can get that by keeping the commandments of God, that's great. Now, what if there's more to this teaching that he gave? If we keep reading a bit, it says, but we cannot keep all the commandments without first knowing them, and we cannot expect to know all, or more than we now know, unless we comply with or keep those we have already received. That which is wrong under one circumstance may be and often is right under another. Okay, that seems kind of interesting, so maybe there's some examples. Oh, well, it goes in to say that God said, thou shalt not kill, but at another time he said, thou shalt utterly destroy. This is the principle on which the government of heaven is conducted, by revelation adapted to the circumstances in which the children of the kingdom are placed. Whatever God requires is right no matter what it is, although we may not see the reason thereof till long after the events transpire. Okay, interesting. Well, before we get much more into what is contained in this teaching by Joseph Smith, let's roll it back to where it originated, back to 1842. So let's go back to the spring of 1842 in Nauvoo, Illinois. Joseph Smith, the founder of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, is 36 years old and at the height of his influence. Publicly, he is admired by his followers as a prophet, a spiritual leader who receives divine revelations. Privately, however, Joseph has begun to introduce and practice plural marriage, or celestial marriage, or spiritual wifery, as some people refer to it. A doctrine that he believes was divinely mandated, by which was kept secret from the general church membership and the wider public. Now, if you listened to the first episode that I released about the conflict between Orson Pratt and Brigham Young, I mentioned that in 1852, there were 3 things that Brigham Young publicly announced. One was the blacks can no longer have the priesthood. Number 2, that Adam was God. And number 3, that the church practiced polygamy or plural marriage. So before 1852, it was a secret thing that only certain people were privy to within the church. So going back to 1842. By this point, Joseph Smith had already entered into polygamous unions with around 9 or 10 women, in addition to his first wife, Emma. Among the more contested proposals Joseph made during this period was to Nancy Rigdon, the 19-year-old daughter of Sidney Rigdon, who was one of Joseph's closest counselors and a prominent figure in the early church. So at the time, Sidney Rigdon was not aware that this proposal had happened or was going to happen. However, a woman who was married to Orson Hyde would be the supposed person who would try to convince Nancy Rigdon into marrying Joseph Smith. Now, we do have some conflicting information on why this meeting was taking place, but as the church says, where there is 2 and 3 witnesses, every word should be established. So the fact that we have 2 witnesses that there was a meeting, we can establish that the fact is they met. Now, something interesting about Orson Hyde. He had apostatized in the church in 1838, and he returned back to fellowship in 1839. There is a rumor that because of his apostasy, the penance that he would have to pay is that he would lose his wife to Joseph Smith in the eternities. And earlier, before that meeting, Miranda Nancy Johnson, who was married to Orson Hyde, would be sealed to Joseph Smith. I want to make a note that when people use the language that Joseph Smith was marrying other men's wives, it can come off that women are property. A better way of saying it would be that Joseph Smith had married women who were already married. But in the context that I just used it about Orson Hyde losing his wife in the eternities, is based on the fact that the early part of the church, especially during the Brigham Young times, women were treated like property. In fact, if Brigham Young thought that you weren't a good member of the church, he could remove your wife and your kids and assign it to someone else. So while I see the improvement that we can make on the language in which we use, I think that that language fits currently in this part of the way that we talk about how the church was run and how women were treated. So, Miranda Nancy Johnson, who was legally married to Orson Hyde, but now sealed for the eternities to Joseph Smith, was asked to have a meeting with Nancy Rigdon. And we have a quote from her brother. He says, "It happened in this way. Nancy had gone to church meeting being held in a grove near the temple lot on which the Mormons were then erecting a temple. An old lady friend, Miranda Johnson Hyde, who lived alone, invited her. Now I want to interject real quick that the reason why she was living alone at this time was because Orson Hyde was on a mission to Palestine. And so Nancy did show up. When they got to the house and had taken off their bonnets, the old lady began to talk to her about the new doctrines of polygamy, which was then being taught, telling Nancy during the conversation that it was a surprise to her when she first heard it, but that she had since come to believe it to be true. While they were talking, Joseph Smith the prophet came into the house and joined them, and the old lady immediately left the room. It was then that Joseph Smith made the proposal of marriage to my sister. Nancy flatly refused him, saying if she ever got married, she would marry a single man or none at all, and thereupon took her bonnet and went home, leaving Joseph at the old lady's home." So now we go back to what this happiness letter is and how it got here. Apparently, sometime after, Joseph Smith had given, through Willard Richards, a letter to give to Nancy Rigdon to try to convince her in the idea of polygamy and why it is right. There are people who say that she was asked to keep it a secret by Joseph Smith, and she did for a while, but eventually John C. Bennett got this letter and published it within a newspaper. So now that we have some context, let's look at this letter again, and let's read a portion of it. Happiness is the object and design of our existence, and will be the end thereof, if we pursue the path that leads to it, and this path is virtue, uprightness, faithfulness, holiness, and keeping all the commandments of God. But we cannot keep all the commandments without first knowing them, and we cannot expect to know all or more than we now know unless we comply with or keep those we have already received. That which is wrong under one circumstance may be and often is right under another. Now, those inflections were made when it was published in John C. Bennett's version, I think to signify for us to read between the lines, as I believe that Joseph Smith was trying to get Nancy Rigdon to do. It goes on to say, into eternity, our Heavenly Father is more liberal in His views and boundless in His mercies and blessings than we are ready to believe or receive. And at this same time is more terrible to the workers of iniquity, more awful in His executions of His punishments, and more ready to detect every false way than we are apt to suppose Him to be. He will be inquired of by His children. He says, ask and ye shall receive, seek and ye shall find. But if you will take that which is not your own, or which I have not given you, you shall be rewarded according to your deeds. But no good thing will I withhold from them who walk uprightly before me, and do my will in all things, who will listen to my voice, and to the voice of my servant whom I have sent. For I delight in those who seek diligently to know my precepts, and abide by the law of my kingdom. For all things shall be made known unto them in mine own due time, and in the end they shall have joy. Now, her brother would go on to relate what happened next. Nancy told father and mother of it. The story got out, and it became the talk of the town that Joseph had made a proposition to Nancy Rigdon to become his wife, and that she refused him. A few days after the occurrence, Joseph Smith came to my father's house and talked the matter over with the family and my sister. The feelings manifested by our family on this occasion were anything but brotherly or sisterly, more especially on the part of Nancy, as she felt that she had been insulted. A day or two later, Joseph Smith returned to my father's house when matters were satisfactorily adjusted between them, and the matter ended. Now, actually having information further, we know that it didn't actually end. There was a letter written to Sidney Rigdon in March of 1843, and in the content thereof, the church has given, or rather the Joseph Smith Papers, has given us some historical introduction. It says, on the 27th March 1843 in Nauvoo, Illinois, Joseph Smith dictated a letter for Sidney Rigdon articulating past grievances between the two men and stating his intention, barring some kind of reconciliation, to have Rigdon disfellowshipped from the church at its upcoming April conference. Rigdon joined the church in 1830, the year it was founded, and he was one of Joseph Smith's closest advisors and counselors in the first presidency for the next decade. In the early 1840s, however, Rigdon's health declined, limiting his ability to function as Joseph Smith's counselor. Moreover, in summer of 1842, Joseph Smith's relationship with Rigdon was substantially damaged by a dispute between Joseph Smith and the Rigdon family, stemming from allegations that Joseph Smith had asked Rigdon's 19-year-old daughter Nancy to be sealed to him as a plural wife. If such a proposal took place, she evidently refused it, meaning she turned him down. The friction between the two men was exacerbated when John C. Bennett, who had been excommunicated a few months earlier, publicized the alleged proposal and published a letter that Joseph Smith purportedly sent to Nancy, which seemed to contain a justification for plural marriage. So, as I said before, we had another reference to this meeting that took place. Well, let's look at that one. In 1845, Orson Hyde, he wrote a pamphlet talking about this very subject contained within. During my absence to Palestine, the conduct of his daughter Nancy became so notorious in the city, according to common rumor, she was regarded generally little if anything better than a public prostitute. Joseph Smith, knowing the conduct she was guilty of, felt anxious to reprove and reclaim her if possible. He accordingly requested my wife to invite her down to her house. He wished to speak with her and show her the impropriety of being gallanted about by so many different men, many of whom were comparatively strangers to her. Her own parents could look upon it and think that all was right, being blind to the fault of their daughter. There being so many of this kind of men visiting Mr. Rigdon's house at the steamboat landing, for he kept some sort of tavern or boarding house, that Mr. Smith did not care to go there to see her. So let's just pause there and say Joseph Smith didn't want to see her at her own house, which is why she was supposedly invited to Orson Hyde's house. It goes on to say, Miss Nancy, I presume, considered her dignity highly insulted as the plain and sharp reproofs she received from the servant of God. She ran home and told her father that Mr. Smith wanted her for a spiritual wife, and that he employed my wife to assist him in obtaining her. This was a good time for Miss Nancy and John C. Bennett to wreak vengeance on the victim of their hatred for his severe admonitions. Mr. Bennett, I think, was a boarder at Mr. Rigdon's at that time, and I am told was all honey with the whole family. No one like Dr. John C. Bennett. Orson Hyde goes on to say that also Mr. Rigdon, or Sidney Rigdon, also thought this was a good time to crush a member of the Johnson family, which would have been Nancy Miranda Johnson, the wife of Orson Hyde, who would divorce him in the future anyway. Now, another thing interesting at this time is that after the death of Joseph Smith, Sidney Rigdon had been excommunicated from the church. So at this time, when Orson Hyde is writing this in 1845, he's going to slander a bit more Mr. Rigdon, or Sidney Rigdon. He says, can Mr. Rigdon believe that Joseph Smith ever tried to seduce his daughter? Can he believe that he ever tried to get her for a spiritual wife? If he really believes this of Mr. Smith, how could he propose to build up the kingdom to him unless he fellowships such abominable works? But if Mr. Smith had tried to get Miss Nancy for a carnal wife, he might probably have been successful. I do not, however, think Mr. Rigdon believes any such thing of Joseph Smith, but because he was rejected as the leader of this people, he now seeks to destroy us by the most cruel slanders. So again, we have a second witness that a meeting took place. However, Orson Hyde is basically saying that the reason why Joseph Smith wanted to meet Nancy Rigdon was to tell her that she was doing wrong, because essentially she was just a whore of the town. She was a prostitute, basically entertaining guys that were staying with Sidney Rigdon in his boarding house. Now, one thing around this time, Joseph Smith, when he would be rejected by women, he would end up slandering them a lot of times in a editorial called The Wasp, which was run by his brother William. Fair Mormon, or FairLatterdaySaints.org, as it was renamed, is a apologetic website which goes after things that are made in claims. But they even say these women's testimonies and character were generally attacked to try to discredit them in an effort to preserve the secrecy which surrounded plural marriage. This factor is complicated by the fact that at least some were guilty of inappropriate behavior, e.g. likely Sarah Pratt. Despite attacks on their character, some remained in Nauvoo and likewise suffered no physical harm, e.g. Nancy Rigdon. Well, that's great that they didn't suffer physical harm, but to be publicly, through the Wasp or otherwise, been told that they are harlots or whores or prostitutes isn't going to do anything good for them in this town, especially when it's not true, and only to save your own self because you want to preserve the secrecy around plural marriage. Going back to Joseph Smith papers, we have a copy of the Sangamo Journal, which was where John C. Bennett published this letter. We have in there that because Joseph's authorship of this letter is uncertain, the letter is presented as an appendix to this volume rather than a featured document. The Sangamo Journal published the letter embedded in a letter from Bennett himself In its 19th of August 1842 issue, Bennet's letter, written on the Erie Canal aboard the steamboat Nassau, was the 6th epistle he sent to that newspaper attacking Joseph Smith and the Latter-day Saints. In May of 1842, Bennet was excommunicated, and he resigned his position as mayor of Nauvoo, Illinois, amid charges of sexual promiscuity and other scandalous offenses. It goes on to say, as in the cases of most of his verifiable plural marriages, Joseph Smith was silent about this issue, neither confirming nor denying either his authorship of the letter or the allegation that he approached Nancy Rigdon to be a plural wife. Joseph Smith's brother William Smith, editor of the Nauvoo newspaper Wasp, denied that Joseph Smith was the letter's author. In September, the Wasp also printed a statement above Sidney Rigdon's signature claiming that, quote, Mr. Smith denied to me the authorship of that letter, end quote. However, Rigdon's statement implied that such a letter did exist. Now, an interesting thing is that if we go back to another section of the Joseph Smith papers, we can find in the book History 1838 to 1856, volume D1, 1 August 1842 to 1 July 1843, an addenda of 27 August 1842, where this letter is included. So then one must ask the question, if Joseph Smith was not the author of this letter, why would the church include it in the history? Why would Joseph Fielding Smith include it in the teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith? And why would they quote, happiness is the object and design of our existence and will be the end thereof if we pursue the path that leads to it, and this path is virtue, uprightness, faithfulness, holiness, and keeping all the commandments of God, if it wasn't written by Joseph Smith. The happiness letter and Joseph Smith's proposal to Nancy Rigdon illustrate a pivotal moment in the early Mormon history, encapsulating the struggle between personal convictions and purported divine revelation. While Joseph sought to justify his actions through theological reasoning, figures like Nancy Rigdon embodied the resistance and ethical dilemmas faced by those caught in the cross currents of prophetic claims and personal morality. Understanding this episode helps paint a fuller picture of the tensions that shaped the early church, illuminating the human stories behind doctrinal development and the far-reaching implications of polygamy. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Mormon History Podcast. I hope that this exploration has shed light on the complexities and human stories behind early church practices and beliefs. Stay tuned next time, where we will continue to uncover and examine the layers of Mormon history. Until next time, have a great day.